Princess Zareth of the Kaytheran Empire had faced down rebellions, negotiated with hostile governments, and commanded respect from warriors twice her size. None of that prepared her for human media. She stood in her assigned quarters on Aurora Station, scrolling through her datapad with growing horror. Article after article, entertainment program after entertainment program, all depicting Kaytheran as monsters. Too tall, too angular, features too sharp, too alien. The distinctive long ears that marked Kaytheran nobility were described as unsettling. The bioluminescent patterns that displayed emotion across their skin were disturbing. One particularly vicious editorial described her species as nature's warning about what happens when evolution prioritizes intimidation over beauty. Zareth set down the datapad and studied her reflection in the polished metal wall. She was tall, nearly 2 meters, towering over most humans she'd encountered. Her features were sharp where humans were soft, angular where they curved. Her skin, marked with patterns that currently pulsed with suppressed orange, frustration, would seem strange to species without bioluminescence. And her ears, swept back in elegant points that indicated her royal bloodline, would indeed look alien to humans accustomed to small, rounded hearing organs. She'd known, intellectually, that Kaytheran and human aesthetic standards differed. But 3 weeks on Aurora Station, watching humans avoid eye contact, seeing them flinch when she moved too quickly, noticing their careful distance, it wore on even royal pride. A chime at her door interrupted her self-examination. She forced her patterns to neutral gray before calling, "Enter." Captain Marcus Webb stepped in with his characteristic easy smile, datapad in hand and uniform somehow both regulation perfect and casually worn. He was her assigned liaison, human diplomatic corps, tasked with helping her navigate station protocols and coordinate with human negotiators. He was also, frustratingly, the hardest human to read she'd ever encountered. "Evening, Princess. Just wanted to go over tomorrow's agenda before," he paused, his smile faltering slightly. "Are you all right? Your patterns are gray." Of course he'd learned to read Kaytheran bioluminescence. Marcus had a disconcerting habit of actually paying attention to the beings he worked with. "I'm fine. What is the schedule?" She moved to the work table, deliberately businesslike. Marcus followed but didn't sit immediately. "The morning session is with the trade delegation. Afternoon is cultural exchange presentations. Pretty dry stuff, but politically necessary. Then there's a diplomatic dinner that I'll do my best to get you out of early because I've tasted the station's formal meal offerings and I wouldn't subject them to a prisoner." He was trying for humor, but his eyes were studying her with that peculiar human intensity that always made her patterns flicker with colors she tried to suppress. "That sounds acceptable." Zareth pulled up the relevant documents, focusing on work rather than the uncomfortable direction her thoughts kept taking. They worked in silence for several minutes, reviewing treaty language, noting concerns for the negotiating teams, coordinating security protocols. It was comfortable, professional, exactly what a diplomatic working relationship should be, which made it worse when the question forced its way out. "Captain Webb." Her voice came out harsher than intended. "May I ask you something personal?" Marcus looked up, surprised but not uncomfortable. "Of course. We've been working together for 3 weeks. I think we're past pure formality. And please, it's Marcus. Captain Webb makes me feel like I should be more dignified than I actually am." "Very well, Marcus." She should stop. She should swallow the question, maintain professional distance, accept that some truths were better left unspoken. Instead, her pride, wounded by 3 weeks of averted eyes and careful distance, demanded an answer. "Am I too ugly for you?" Marcus froze, his datapad hovering forgotten in midair. "I'm sorry, what?" "Am I too ugly for you? For humans?" The words tumbled out now, defensive anger masking genuine vulnerability. "Is that why your people cannot look at me directly? Why your media portrays Kaytheran as monsters? Why everyone on this station treats me with such careful distance. Her patterns flashed frustrated orange. I understand aesthetic standards differ between species, but I'm not blind to how humans view my kind. She expected many possible responses: diplomatic deflection, uncomfortable stammering, perhaps honest acknowledgement that yes, Theron were frightening to human sensibilities. She did not expect Marcus to laugh. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was surprised, almost delighted, the kind of sound someone makes when confronted with something so absurd they can't contain their reaction. He actually bent forward slightly, hand covering his mouth as if trying to stop it, his shoulders shaking. Zareth's patterns flashed angry red, humiliation mixing with fury. She stood abruptly, her height making the movement imposing. "I see, thank you for clarifying." "Wait," Marcus was still fighting his smile as he stood, reaching out but not quite touching her arm. "No, please wait. I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing at the question. Princess, you think you're ugly." The genuine disbelief in his voice was almost worse than mockery would have been. Zareth pulled away, moving toward the door. "I don't require pity, Captain." "It's not pity." Marcus moved to block her path, not threatening, just present. "I promise you, that is absolutely not pity. Just please, give me 5 minutes to explain why that question is possibly the most ridiculous thing I've heard in my entire diplomatic career." Zareth's pattern cycled through angry red, confused orange, and wary yellow. Her pride insisted she leave. Her curiosity and something else, something more vulnerable, made her stay. 5 minutes, she said coldly. Marcus exhaled in relief, gesturing back to the table. "Thank you. Okay. I need to show you something, and I need you to trust that I'm not mocking you. I'm genuinely trying to explain a massive cultural misunderstanding." He pulled up his personal datapad, not the official diplomatic device but his private unit. His fingers moved quickly through files, and then he turned the screen toward her. Images filled the display. Human artwork. Paintings, digital renderings, sculptures, sketches, all depicting Theron, but not the propaganda posters she'd seen in media. These were different. A painting showed a Theron warrior in profile, bioluminescent patterns rendered in exquisite detail, the sharp features emphasized as powerful rather than frightening. A sculpture captured the elegant length of Theron ears, making them look like natural crowns. Digital art portrayed Theron height as impressive, commanding, beautiful. "What is this?" Zareth asked quietly. "Human civilian art. Created by people who have never met Theron in person, working from images and descriptions and imagination." Marcus scrolled through more examples. "Yes, some human media portrays Theron negatively. Propaganda from the war years, political fear-mongering meant to justify conflict. But that's not how humans actually see your species." He looked up at her, his expression serious despite the smile still playing at his lips. "Princess, humans find difference attractive. Your height, impressive. Your patterns, gorgeous. Your features," he gestured at her face. "Striking, elegant, regal, pick your compliment, they all apply." Zareth stared at the artwork, her patterns cycling through confused colors. "You're saying humans find Theron aesthetically pleasing." "I'm saying you asked if you're too ugly, and that question is absurd because you're probably the most beautiful being on this entire station." Marcus's smile had faded into something more earnest. "Half the human staff are too intimidated to look at you directly. But it's not because you're frightening. It's because you're stunning and royalty, and so far out of their league it's not even funny." Zareth didn't have words. Her entire understanding of the past 3 weeks was reformulating. The avoidance, the distance. Is people being intimidated by someone gorgeous and powerful, not people being disgusted? Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. A gesture she'd learned indicated his discomfort. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Lieutenant Morrison stammers every time you speak to him because he finds you attractive and can't handle it. The station botanist nearly walked into a wall watching you pass yesterday." Chef Rodriguez has been trying to figure out your favorite foods for 2 weeks because he wants to impress you. Zareth sat down slowly, processing this information. And you? The question emerged before she could stop it. Is that why you've maintained such careful professional boundaries? Marcus's expression shifted to something complicated, embarrassment mixed with honesty mixed with resignation. Yes, that's exactly why I've maintained very careful professional boundaries. Because you're a princess, I'm your diplomatic liaison, and there are approximately 50 regulations against me admitting that I find you distractingly attractive. He met her eyes directly, one of the few humans who regularly did. But since you directly asked if you were too ugly for humans, I figured honesty was more important than protocol for once. The confession hung in the air between them. Zareth's patterns flushed through surprised silver, then confused orange, then something warmer, a soft gold she rarely allowed herself to display, before she forced them back to neutral gray. I see, she said, her voice not quite steady. That is unexpected information. Yeah, Marcus laughed again, but gentler this time, self-deprecating. Welcome to the mess that is human emotional complexity. We suppress everything, hide our feelings behind professional boundaries, and then occasionally have complete honesty breakdowns when someone asks the exactly wrong question. Wrong question. You asked if you were too ugly. Princess, I've spent 3 weeks trying very hard not to stare, composing my face into professional neutrality, and generally failing to remember how to form coherent sentences around you. His smile was rueful. So yes, wrong question. The right question would be, am I making all the humans uncomfortable because they find me attractive and don't know how to handle it? Zareth's patterns shifted to amused gold despite herself. That seems like a very specific question. It's the accurate one, though. Marcus gestured at his datapad, still displaying the human artwork. I'm sorry you spent 3 weeks thinking you were frightening us. The truth is significantly more embarrassing for everyone involved. Zareth looked at the images again, Theron rendered with clear appreciation. Human artists finding beauty in the very features she'd thought were monstrous to them. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison's stammering, the botanist's wall collision, Marcus's careful distance. We're idiots, she declared. Completely, Marcus agreed. Cross-species communication is apparently even harder than the textbooks suggest. And now we have 2 more weeks of negotiations, while I process the fact that human avoidance means attraction rather than disgust. If it helps, I'll be processing the fact that I just confessed to finding a princess attractive in direct violation of multiple diplomatic protocols. Marcus's smile was crooked. We can be professionally awkward together. Despite everything, the embarrassment, the confusion, the reorganization of 3 weeks of assumptions, Zareth found herself laughing. A Theron laugh like wind chimes that made Marcus's eyes widen slightly. You've never heard me laugh before, she observed. No, it's... He paused, then shook his head. I'm going to stop myself before I violate any more protocols tonight. But yes, that's new and nice. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the conversation having ventured far beyond their usual professional territory. Finally, Zareth straightened, forcing her patterns to businesslike orange. We should review tomorrow's schedule, and perhaps establish new protocols for working together now that's certain. Misunderstandings have been clarified. Agreed. Though I'm keeping the maintain professional boundaries protocol, just with better understanding of why it exists. Marcus returned to the table, but his smile hadn't completely faded. For what it's worth, Princess, I'm glad you asked. Even if the question was ridiculous. For what it's worth, Captain, Marcus, I'm glad you laughed, even though I initially wanted to throw you out the airlock for it. Noted. I'll try to make my future laughter less potentially airlock-inducing. They returned to work, reviewing schedules and protocols, but something had shifted. The careful distance remained, professionalism still mattered, but it was informed now. Understood. Not rejection, but restraint. And Zareth's patterns, carefully controlled, kept flickering to soft gold when she thought Marcus wasn't looking. He was, and his smile, equally carefully controlled, kept threatening to break through his diplomatic composure. 3 weeks of misunderstanding, resolved by one ridiculous question and one human's inability to suppress honest laughter. Sometimes, Zareth thought, diplomacy was significantly more complicated than warfare. But occasionally it was worth the complications. The morning trade delegation meeting was torture, but not for the reasons Zareth had anticipated. The negotiations themselves were straightforward: tariff rates, shipping lanes, resource allocation. Standard diplomatic fare that she'd handled hundreds of times. What was torture was being hyper-aware of every human in the room now that she understood their averted gazes differently. Lieutenant Morrison presented the Human Mining Consortium's proposal, stammering 3 times and accidentally calling her "Your Highness" instead of "Your Grace." Wrong honorific, which he immediately realized, which made him stammer more. Zareth had previously interpreted this as fear. Now she saw it as Marcus had described, a man completely unable to handle attraction to someone he considered out of his league. The realization made her patterns flicker with amused gold, which she quickly suppressed. Across the table, Marcus caught the color shift and pressed his lips together to hide a smile. He'd positioned himself as neutral facilitator, but she could see him watching her watch the other humans, his eyes bright with suppressed humor. They were both suffering through this meeting with entirely new contexts, and it was ridiculous. When Morrison finished his presentation and sat down with visible relief, Zareth forced herself to focus. The proposed rates are acceptable with modifications to the 3rd and 7th clauses. I'll submit detailed revisions by tomorrow. Thank you, Your Grace. Morrison managed the correct honorific this time, then immediately looked away when their eyes met. The meeting continued for another hour. By the end, Zareth had mentally catalogued 6 more humans whose intimidation now read as nervous attraction. It was both flattering and deeply strange. As everyone filed out, Marcus lingered, ostensibly reviewing his notes. When the room cleared, he looked up with that crooked smile she was learning to recognize. So, processing going well. I've just recontextualized 3 weeks of interactions. It's disorienting. Zareth gathered her materials. Morrison called me "Your Highness" again. He does that when he's nervous, which is constantly around you. Marcus moved to walk beside her as they left the conference room. For what it's worth, you handled it gracefully. Your patterns only flickered once. You were watching my patterns. I'm your liaison. It's my job to monitor your comfort level and emotional state during negotiations. He paused. Also, I've spent 3 weeks learning to read K-Theron bioluminescence, because understanding you seemed important. The casual admission made Zareth's patterns shift to surprised silver before she controlled them. Most humans don't bother learning K-Theron emotional displays. Most humans aren't assigned to work closely with K-Theron royalty. They'd reached a quieter corridor, away from the main station traffic. Marcus's professional mask slipped slightly. Also, most humans aren't trying very hard not to stare, which means paying attention to alternative information sources like pattern changes. Is this you violating more protocols? Probably. I'm apparently terrible at self-restraint when you ask direct questions. He pulled up his datapad. Speaking of which, we should discuss tonight's cultural exchange presentation. The human delegation is planning a performance that might benefit from K-Theron context. They found an empty meeting room and spent the next hour in productive work. But the dynamic had changed. Where before Marcus had maintained careful physical distance, now he sat close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed. Where before he'd kept his gaze professionally neutral, now she caught him watching her with undisguised interest before remembering himself and looking away. And Zareth found herself responding, allowing her patterns to show more emotion, leaning closer when reviewing documents, laughing at his jokes instead of maintaining royal composure. They were playing a dangerous game, dancing around professional boundaries that were increasingly flimsy. "Marcus," she said during a pause in their work, "last night you said you found me distractingly attractive. What did you mean by distractingly?" He looked up from his datapad, and something complicated crossed his face. "Do you really want me to answer that honestly?" "I asked, didn't I?" Theron valued directness. "Right, directness." Marcus set down his datapad with deliberate care. "I meant that I lose my train of thought mid-sentence when you smile. I meant that I've reread the same treaty clause 5 times because I was watching your patterns shift colors instead of focusing on the words. I meant that every time we work late and you're tired enough to let your formal mask slip, I have to remind myself that you're a princess. I'm your liaison. And there are very good reasons I'm not allowed to do what I want to do." Zareth's patterns flushed warm gold, pleasure mixed with curiosity. "And what do you want to do?" "Princess." "Zareth, if we're being direct, use my name." "Zareth." He said it carefully, like testing new words. "What I want to do violates approximately a dozen protocols, would scandalize both our governments, and is a spectacularly bad idea given that you're here for 2 more weeks before returning to Theron space and your actual life." "That's not an answer. It's the diplomatic answer." "I'm not interested in diplomatic answers right now. I'm interested in honest ones." She leaned forward. "You laughed when I asked if I was too ugly. You showed me artwork of humans finding Theron beautiful. You've admitted to finding me attractive, but you're still maintaining careful distance. Why?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "Because if I stop maintaining distance, I'll do something stupid like fall completely for someone I can't actually have. You're a princess with responsibilities, expectations, a life waiting for you in Theron space. I'm a human diplomatic officer whose job ends when these negotiations do. The timing is impossible, the politics are worse, and getting emotionally invested would be cruel to both of us. So you're protecting us both by maintaining professional boundaries." "I'm trying to. Not very successfully, apparently, given this conversation." Zareth studied him. This human who'd learned her people's emotional language, who found her beautiful when she'd believed herself monstrous, who was deliberately restraining himself for logical reasons that she couldn't actually argue against. "What if I don't want you to maintain distance?" The question emerged quietly. Marcus's expression cracked into something raw. "Then I'd ask what you're hoping happens in 2 weeks when you leave. Because I'm trying very hard not to let myself want something that has an expiration date." "And if there wasn't an expiration date?" Zareth. Her comm unit chimed, interrupting whatever he might have said. She glanced at it with frustration. "The afternoon session begins in 10 minutes. Right work, protocols, appropriate professional behavior." Marcus stood, his diplomatic mask reasserting itself, but his eyes were still intense. "We should go." They walked to the cultural exchange presentation in careful silence, the conversation unfinished and hanging between them. But as they took their seats, Marcus beside her rather than across, close enough that she could feel his warmth, Zareth made a decision. She'd come to Aurora Station expecting political negotiations. She'd found something else entirely. A human who saw her as beautiful, who learned her language, who was trying very hard to be noble about impossible situations. 2 weeks remained before she was expected to return home. 2 weeks to figure out if Marcus's careful restraint was wisdom or cowardice. 2 weeks to decide if the question, "Am I too ugly for you?" had changed everything or nothing. The cultural presentation began, human performers showcasing traditional music and art. But Zareth's attention was elsewhere, her mind racing through possibilities, politics, and the dangerous mathematics of wanting something you weren't supposed to have. Beside her, Marcus sat with perfect diplomatic posture, his eyes forward, his expression neutral. But his hand, resting on the armrest between them, was close enough that their fingers almost touched. Almost, but not quite. The distance between almost and actually, suddenly, felt like the most important measurement in the galaxy. The diplomatic dinner that evening was exactly as tedious as Marcus had warned, but Zareth barely noticed. She was too busy analyzing the past 24 hours, trying to solve an equation with too many variables and no clear solution. Variable 1. She was expected to return to K-Theron space in 2 weeks, resume her royal duties, and marry appropriately within her rank, an expectation she'd accepted without question for 30 years. Variable 2. A human captain had laughed at the suggestion she was ugly, shown her artwork depicting her species as beautiful, and admitted to finding her distractingly attractive. Variable 3. She was starting to realize that the careful loneliness she'd maintained for years, the price of royal duty, had only felt acceptable because she hadn't known anything else was possible. Variable 4. Marcus Webb, with his easy smile and impossible ethics, had made her question everything. "You're thinking very loudly," Marcus murmured beside her. They were seated together at the formal table. Protocol dictated her liaison sit close enough for consultation, but most delegates were engaged in their own conversations, giving them relative privacy. "I'm recalculating my future," Zareth replied quietly. "It's complicated. Anything I can help with?" "You're the primary complication." Marcus's smile was rueful. "Sorry about that. I'm not asking for apologies." Zareth pushed her barely touched food around her plate. The station's formal cuisine was indeed terrible. "I'm trying to figure out if what you said earlier was logical caution or emotional cowardice." "That's blunt. I'm K-Theron. We value directness, remember." She turned to look at him fully, ignoring the other delegates. "You said getting emotionally invested would be cruel because I'm leaving in 2 weeks, but you're already invested, aren't you? The careful distance, the protocol maintenance, the restraint, those are symptoms of caring, not." Marcus didn't answer immediately. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his utensil, and his jaw worked as if he were physically restraining words. Finally, he set down his fork with deliberate precision and met her eyes. "Yes, I'm already invested." The admission was quiet, meant only for her. "I've been invested since week 1, when you corrected my pronunciation of your name and actually seemed pleased that I cared enough to get it right. I'm in so far over my head that maintaining professional distance is the only thing keeping me from doing something catastrophically stupid. Such as asking you not to leave. Such as proposing solutions that would require you to abandon your responsibilities. Such as admitting that watching you prepare to go back to K-Theron space and marry someone appropriate feels like." He stopped himself, his diplomatic training reasserting control. "Such as making this about my feelings instead of respecting your position and your choices." Zareth's patterns flickered through complex colors, frustrated orange, sad blue, determined gold. "And if I told you I don't want to marry someone appropriate, that I've spent 30 years being a dutiful princess and I'm tired of appropriate, then I'd say you're making decisions based on 2 weeks of interaction, which isn't enough time to restructure your entire life." Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "And I'd worry that I'm the catalyst for a choice you might regret." "You're infuriating." "I'm trying to be ethical. It's not my strongest quality, but I'm making an effort." He glanced around the formal dinner, then back to her. "Zareth, I'm not saying this because I don't want you to stay. I'm saying this because I do want you to stay desperately, and that makes me the worst person to advise you on whether you should." Before Zareth could respond, the K-Theron ambassador, Lord Vexen, her father's representative and her nominal supervisor during these negotiations, rose to make formal remarks about the successful trade agreements. The moment for private conversation ended, but the conversation itself was far from finished. 3 hours later, after diplomatic pleasantries and formal toasts and the excruciating slowness of official proceedings, Zareth finally escaped to her quarters. She'd barely removed her formal attire when her comm unit chimed with a priority message from K-Theron space. Her father's face filled the screen, Emperor Kethril, whose stern features softened only marginally when addressing his daughter. Zareth, Lord Vexen reports the negotiations are concluding successfully. Well done. Thank you, father. Which means you'll return home within the week. Good timing. House Mortek has formally proposed a bonding alliance. Their eldest son is appropriate rank, impressive military record, strong political connections. I've reviewed the terms and find them acceptable. Zareth's patterns flashed through several colors before she controlled them. You've agreed to a bonding alliance without consulting me. I'm consulting you now. Do you have objections to House Mortek? She had thousands of objections, none of which had anything to do with House Mortek specifically, and everything to do with a human captain who taught her that maybe duty wasn't the only thing that mattered. But she couldn't say that, not to her father, not yet. I need time to consider. Kethril's eyes narrowed. Zareth, you're 30 years old. You've known a political bonding was inevitable. What requires consideration? She searched for diplomatic language. The negotiations here have given me new perspective on alliance structures. I want to ensure any bonding serves Theran interests optimally, not just traditionally. It was vague enough to sound reasonable while buying her time. Kethril studied her through the calm screen, and Zareth wondered if her patterns were betraying more than her words. Very well. You have until you return home to consider. But Zareth, don't confuse temporary diplomatic courtesies with actual alternatives. You're a princess of Theran. Your duty is to your people, not to whatever distractions you've encountered on that station. The call ended before she could respond. Zareth stood in her quarters, staring at the blank screen, her patterns cycling through angry red and frustrated orange and sad blue. A chime at her door. She knew who it was before she called entry. Marcus stepped in, still in his formal uniform, his expression concerned. I saw the Theran priority transmission. Are you all right? My father has arranged a political bonding for me. I'm expected to accept upon my return. The words came out flat, emotionless. Marcus went very still. I see. Do you? Zareth's patterns flashed angry red. Because I don't. I don't see how I'm supposed to return to Theran space and bond with someone appropriate when I've spent 2 weeks learning that appropriate might mean wrong. I don't see how I'm supposed to maintain duty when duty suddenly feels like prison. I don't. She stopped, her patterns flickering wildly. Marcus had crossed the room and taken her hands, first time he'd initiated physical contact, and his expression was raw with concern. Breathe, he said quietly. Just breathe for a minute. Zareth realized she'd been speaking too fast, her patterns cycling too rapidly, her control fracturing. She forced herself to slow down, to match Marcus's steady breathing, a technique he'd taught her during stressful negotiations. When she'd calmed enough to speak normally, Marcus asked, "What do you want? Not what duty requires, not what your father expects. What do you actually want?" "I want to stay here." The truth emerged like pressure releasing. "I want to keep working with you. I want to keep learning how humans see beauty differently than I thought. I want to not marry someone I've never met just because he's appropriate rank." Her patterns shifted to vulnerable blue. "I want to choose, for once in my life, something for myself instead of for Theran politics." "Then choose." Marcus's voice was steady despite the intensity in his eyes. "But choose knowing all the options, not just reacting against your father's expectations." "What options? I'm a princess. My options are duty or disgrace. Or you create new options." He pulled up his datapad, showing her documents she recognized, treaty implementation requirements, ongoing negotiation needs, diplomatic position proposals. "The peace treaty we've been building will need oversight. Long-term implementation. Someone from Theran leadership who understands both species, who can bridge cultural gaps, who has experience in these negotiations." Zareth stared at the documents. "You want me to stay as a permanent diplomatic liaison. I want you to have the choice to stay, if that's what you want. Frame it as extended royal duty, fulfilling the treaty you've negotiated rather than abandoning it. Your father can't call that disgraceful when it serves K-Theran interests. Marcus was speaking quickly now, the words tumbling out like he'd been planning this. It's not traditional, but it's defensible, strategic. Shows commitment to peace, rather than abandonment of responsibility. And if my father refuses, then I request transfer to K-Theran space as human ambassador. I learn your language, beyond what I know now, your customs, your court politics. I navigate your world instead of you navigating mine. His grip on her hands tightened. The point is, there are options between duty and disgrace. We just have to be brave enough to pursue them. Zareth's patterns bloomed into surprised gold. You'd really request transfer to K-Theran space. Leave your home, your career path, everything you know. You asked last night if you were too ugly for humans. I'm trying to demonstrate exactly how wrong that question was. Marcus's smile was crooked. Besides, I'm tired of professional boundaries and careful distance. I'm ready to fight for what I actually want instead of what's diplomatically appropriate. And what do you want? You, here, there, anywhere. I'm flexible on location. But I want you. And I want you to choose this because you want it, not because you're running from something else. Zareth pulled him closer, their different heights meaning she had to look down slightly to meet his eyes. I want to stay, not to run from duty, but because I've found something here worth staying for. Is that clear enough? Crystal clear. Marcus's smile was genuine now, bright and unguarded. Though we should probably figure out how to present this to both our governments in ways that don't cause interstellar incidents. I thought you were ready to cause incidents. I'm ready to cause necessary incidents. There's a difference. He pulled up more documents on his datapad. If we frame your extended stay as crucial to treaty implementation, emphasize the strategic value of having K-Theran royalty overseeing the peace process, demonstrate how your presence benefits both species. They spent the next 3 hours drafting proposals, building arguments, constructing a framework that would allow Zareth to stay without abandoning her responsibilities. It was practical, strategic, and exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that had made their professional partnership work. But underneath the logistics, something else was happening. Marcus's careful distance had dissolved. They sat close together, shoulders touching, occasionally reaching for the same document and laughing when their hands collided. Zareth let her patterns show truthfully, gold for happiness, blue for affection, silver for the nervous excitement of making a choice that felt both terrifying and right. This might not work, she said around midnight, when the proposals were drafted and they were both exhausted. My father might refuse. Your superiors might deny your transfer request. The politics might be impossible. Then we figure out Plan C and Plan D if that fails. Marcus turned to face her fully. Zareth, I spent 3 weeks trying to be noble and distant and professionally appropriate. I'm done with that. Whatever it takes to make this work, we'll figure it out together. Together, she tested the word, let it settle. I like how that sounds. Me too. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face. First intentional intimate contact, his hand warm against her skin. For the record, you're not too ugly for humans. You're not too different or too other or too anything. You're exactly right, and I'm falling in love with you, and I don't care how complicated the politics are. Zareth's patterns bloomed into brilliant gold, pure joy, unguarded and honest. Among my people, when someone declares their feelings so directly, the honorable response is equal honesty. So I'll be direct. I love you too, Marcus Webb. I've loved you since you laughed at my question instead of pitying me. I love your ethics and your terrible jokes and your ability to see solutions when I see only obstacles. She leaned down, their height difference requiring coordination, and kissed him. It was clumsy at first, different biologies requiring adjustment, but they'd gotten good at navigating difference through patience and communication. When they broke apart, Marcus was smiling like he'd discovered something precious. We're really doing this, defying expectations, restructuring our careers, choosing each other over appropriate duty. Apparently, though I'm blaming you when my father is furious. Fair, I'll blame you when my superiors question my judgment. Deal. They sat together in her quarters as station night deepened, planning arguments and building futures, and being wildly inappropriate by every diplomatic standard. Somewhere in K-Theron space, her father was expecting her dutiful return. Somewhere in human bureaucracy, regulations existed about fraternization and protocol. Neither of them cared. Marcus, Zareth said eventually. Yeah. Thank you for laughing. That night when I asked if I was too ugly. Thank you for finding my question absurd instead of pitying me. Thank you for asking. For being brave enough to say what you were feeling even when you thought the answer might hurt. He pulled her closer. And for the record, you're still the most beautiful being on this station. That hasn't changed. Her patterns glowed soft gold in the dim light. Flatterer. Honest observer. He kissed her again, gentler this time. I'm very good at observation. It's why I'm an excellent diplomat. Modest too. One of my many virtues. They stayed together until dawn, drafting plans and building arguments and occasionally abandoning work entirely for more interesting activities. When station morning arrived, they had proposals ready, counterarguments prepared, and a shared determination that felt unshakable. The treaty signing happened 3 days later, with one unexpected addition to the final document. Princess Zareth would remain on Aurora Station as K-Theron permanent diplomatic representative, ensuring treaty compliance and fostering continued cooperation between species. Lord Vexen had objected. Emperor Kethril had been furious. But the arguments were sound. Someone needed to oversee implementation. K-Theron interests required representation. And who better than the princess who'd negotiated the treaty? Marcus was officially assigned as her permanent human liaison, which caused considerably less controversy on the human side, though his supervisor did pull him aside to ask if he understood what he was getting into. Completely, Marcus had replied, and I'm certain. 6 months later, Zareth stood in their shared quarters, no longer temporary diplomatic housing, but actual home, reviewing proposals for the next phase of trade expansion. Marcus was at the desk, arguing via comm with someone in human bureaucracy about resource allocation, with the patient frustration of someone who did this regularly. Her father had eventually accepted her choice, though their relationship remained strained. House Mortak had found another alliance. K-Theron court politics continued to question her decisions. None of it mattered as much as she'd thought it would. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked later, after his bureaucratic battle had ended in qualified victory, choosing this over traditional expectations. Zareth looked around their quarters, mixture of K-Theron and human aesthetics, combination of their belongings, space that belonged to neither culture but to them specifically. She thought about the past 6 months. Navigating 2 governments, building bridges,